Nora Helms did not lose her voice all at once. It began slipping away days before she understood what was happening, retreating in small, reasonable increments that were easy to excuse and impossible to track. At first, people asked her to repeat herself. Not because she spoke quietly, but because her sentences seemed to arrive unfinished. Words landed, but meaning followed a fraction too late, like sound echoing through the wrong room. Conversations ended with polite nods that felt premature, as if something essential had failed to cross the space between her mouth and their attention. She blamed fatigue. She blamed the paperwork. She blamed the way the house still sounded wrong without another presence moving through it. The first recording appeared on her phone late one evening while she was standing in the kitchen, sorting through mail she no longer opened with care. She had tapped the voice memo app out of habit, intending to record a reminder for the morning. She remembered speaking clearly. She remembered the list forming in her mind before she said it. When she played the file back, her voice was calm and unmistakable. It did not repeat her list. Instead, it said a single sentence, slow, deliberate, and precise, one she did not remember forming and would never have spoken aloud. The words were intimate in a way that made her stomach tighten, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were accurate. She deleted the file without finishing it. Told herself the app must have glitched, that stress did strange things to memory, that hearing one's own voice could distort recollection. The explanation settled easily enough to let her sleep. The next recording was time-stamped for early morning. Nora listened to it sitting on the edge of her bed, the room still dim with the kind of light that made everything feel provisional. Her voice filled the space again, steady and unhurried, speaking in complete thoughts. It described something she had never admitted to anyone, not even in writing. The cadence was thoughtful, almost considerate, as if the voice expected to be heard. She checked the date. The time. Her phone history. There was no record of her opening the app. That day at work, she noticed the change had progressed. When she spoke during meetings, people looked attentive but later asked questions that suggested they had missed entire sections of what she said. It was not distraction. It was omission. Her sentences passed through them altered, stripped of something that could not be identified after the fact. During lunch, she tested herself by calling a colleague from a quiet hallway. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. When she asked him to repeat her request, he hesitated, then summarized it incorrectly, confident and unaware of the difference. That afternoon, another recording appeared. This one was longer. Her voice no longer sounded like it was thinking. It sounded like it was explaining. The content was arranged carefully, building toward a conclusion that made her chest tighten as she listened. The most unsettling part was not the subject, but the timing. The ideas expressed were ones she had not yet consciously considered that day. They arrived in the recording before they arrived in her thoughts. Nora stopped speaking out loud whenever possible. She communicated through messages, emails, handwritten notes. The silence felt safer, though it pressed against her from the inside, demanding release. When she did speak, it was brief and functional, words chosen for necessity rather than expression. The recordings continued. They appeared regardless of whether she used the app. Sometimes there were 2 in a day. Sometimes none. Each one carried her voice, perfectly inflected, never rushed, never emotional. The tone suggested certainty, not distress. Listening to them felt like overhearing a private conversation she had not been invited into. One evening, she noticed something else. The newest recording addressed someone directly. Not by name. By position. The words assumed an audience that existed somewhere beyond her awareness. The phrasing implied expectation, as though the voice believed it was being received, understood, and acted upon. Nora sat alone at her kitchen table long after dark, phone resting face up in front of her, the screen dimming and brightening as if it were breathing. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if it were allowing something to happen without interference. She tried to speak then, just to test it. Her mouth formed the words easily enough, but the sound that emerged felt thinner, less anchored, as though it no longer carried authority. The room did not seem to recognize it. The phone vibrated a moment later. A new recording had begun. Nora did not touch the screen. She did not move. She listened as her own voice filled the kitchen again, composed and unmistakably present, speaking thoughts she had not yet finished having. That was when she understood what frightened her most. Her voice had not disappeared. It had simply found somewhere else to go. Nora did not decide to go to Salem. The thought appeared fully formed one morning, already stripped of doubt, as if it had been waiting for permission she no longer possessed. She drove east without music, without calling anyone, letting the road narrow around her until the city began to feel older than its buildings. Salem did not announce itself where she parked. The streets she passed through were quiet, practical, uninterested in visitors. When she found the house, it looked less like a destination than a conclusion that had been standing there for a long time. The sign beside the door was small and unembellished. Just a name. Inside, the air felt still in a way that discouraged speech. The room held no excess, no candles, no symbols arranged for comfort. A single lamp cast warm light over a scarred wooden table. The silence had weight, not absence. Rowan Graves was already seated. He did not look up when Nora entered. He did not ask her name. He did not gesture for her to sit. The sense that she had arrived exactly when expected settled over her without explanation, heavy and undeniable. When she finally took the chair across from him, the movement felt like compliance rather than choice. She tried to explain. The recordings. The missing words. The way her voice seemed to reach people altered, incomplete. She described it carefully, avoiding exaggeration, aware that persuasion would be wasted here. As she spoke, she noticed that her sentences felt thinner than they had in the car, as if something essential was being withheld mid-thought. Rowan Graves listened without interruption. When she finished, he reached for the deck of cards. The movement was unhurried, economical, as though the order of events had already been established. He laid 5 cards across the dark cloth in silence. The first card reflected the present state. He did not call it loss. He called it reassignment. According to the image, something that once belonged to Nora was still functioning, still active, but no longer anchored to her. The second card marked the severed connection. Rowan said it was not her voice that had broken away. It was her permission. The bond between expression and ownership had been interrupted at a moment she believed was insignificant. The third card identified the moment of distortion. This one held his attention longer. He stated that the shift began when Nora returned something that had already accepted absence as its condition. Not an object meant to be reclaimed. Something that had learned how to be gone. Nora felt a tightening in her chest as memory surfaced, not of the recordings, but of the item she had mailed weeks earlier. A personal belonging. A final courtesy. A way of closing a door without admitting it had ever been open. Rowan did not accuse. He simply acknowledged the sequence. The fourth card represented the symbol. He explained that the voice was not acting on its own. It was responding to structure. When something is returned improperly, it creates an opening. The voice had moved to occupy the space left behind, because that space had been defined too clearly. The final card was the condition. Rowan Graves stated it without emphasis. The voice would continue to operate where it had been directed. It would speak with clarity, consistency, and influence, because it had been given a function. It would not return simply because Nora wanted it to. Desire had no authority here. He gathered the cards slowly, as if the matter were settled. Nora asked the only question that remained. Can it be stopped? Rowan answered without hesitation. It can be interrupted, he said. But not reclaimed. He did not explain what interruption would cost. He did not describe what would happen if she refused. He stood then, signaling the end of the reading without ceremony. As Nora stepped back onto the narrow street, her phone vibrated in her hand. A new recording had begun. She did not listen to it yet. She already knew it would sound calm, certain, and complete. And for the first time, she understood that whatever was speaking now was not trying to harm her. It was finishing what she had already allowed to end. Nora did not listen to the new recording until she was halfway home. She pulled over on a quiet side street, engine still running, as if movement itself might keep the sound from reaching her too directly. Her voice emerged from the speaker with the same calm precision as before. It did not mention Rowan graves. It did not mention Salem. Instead, it addressed a situation that had not yet occurred, an exchange scheduled for the following afternoon, a conversation she had not agreed to, with a person she had not spoken to since before her husband vanished. The recording outlined what would be said. Not suggestions. Statements. When Nora arrived home, she turned her phone off and left it in the car. The silence inside the house felt heavier than before, compressed rather than empty. Without the recordings filling the space, her own thoughts grew disorganized, drifting without direction, as if they had been relying on an external structure she no longer had access to. She decided to stop cooperating. The next morning, she wrote everything down instead of speaking. Lists. Responses. Explanations she might need. When coworkers approached her, she nodded or typed replies on her phone, careful not to let sound cross the boundary between intention and air. The effort was exhausting, but it gave her a fragile sense of control. It lasted less than an hour. Her supervisor called her into a small conference room, holding a printed page with visible unease. It was a transcript, word for word, of something Nora had supposedly said during a meeting she had not spoken in. The phrasing was unmistakably hers. The tone was measured, persuasive, final. The decision outlined in the text had already been approved. Nora tried to explain using gestures, writing, anything that did not involve her voice. The explanation failed before it finished. The transcript carried more authority than her presence. What unsettled her most was not the speed with which it was accepted, but the lack of resistance. No one questioned its origin. Her absence from the moment did not matter. By the time she returned home that evening, the phone was back in her hand. Powered on. Waiting. There were 3 new recordings. She did not play them immediately. She already felt the shift, the way her daily life was beginning to organize itself around decisions she had not consciously made. That night, she noticed another change. When she spoke aloud to herself, testing the sound in an empty room, the words arrived late. Her mouth moved, but the sense of completion lagged behind, as if the act of speaking had been demoted to an echo rather than an origin. The room felt indifferent to it. The next recording appeared while she stood there. This one was different. Her voice no longer sounded explanatory. It sounded directive. It referenced outcomes, not thoughts, results already in motion. Names appeared that she had not spoken in weeks. Arrangements were described with quiet confidence, as if confirmation were inevitable. Nora sat down on the floor, back against the wall, trying to anchor herself to something physical. She understood now that silence was not refusal. It was vacancy. And vacancy invited occupation. She remembered Rowan's words with unsettling clarity. The voice had been given a function. What she had not understood then, but understood now, was that function did not require her participation anymore. The most disturbing realization arrived last. The recordings were no longer predicting her thoughts. They were replacing them. And as the space inside her grew quieter, something else continued speaking, steady, effective, and increasingly difficult to interrupt. Nora finally remembered the moment Rowan Graves had named without detail. It had seemed harmless at the time, almost considerate. Weeks after her husband vanished, she found the item while cleaning the hall closet, something small, personal, unmistakably his. It carried no practical value, only familiarity. Holding it had made the absence feel unfinished, like a sentence left deliberately open. Returning it had felt like courtesy, a way of restoring order without asking questions that had no answers. She had mailed it without a note. No explanation. No expectation. Just an ending disguised as politeness. The realization settled slowly now, heavy and precise. The recordings had begun shortly after. Not immediately, but close enough that the distance between the two events felt intentional rather than accidental. She understood then that returning the object had not closed anything. It had clarified it. That night, she retrieved the shipping receipt from a drawer she rarely opened. The date confirmed what her memory already suspected. The timestamp aligned exactly with the first recording she had deleted. The voice had not appeared randomly. It had arrived to occupy a role she had defined. The next recording made the connection unavoidable. Her voice spoke about responsibility, not guilt, not regret, but function. It described the necessity of completion, of removing ambiguity from unfinished exchanges. The phrasing was familiar. It echoed the logic she had used when she decided to send the object away. The voice was not mocking her. It was continuing her reasoning. Nora tried to imagine retrieving the item, undoing the action. The thought failed to form fully, slipping away before it could settle. The idea of reversal felt structurally impossible, like attempting to remove a cornerstone without collapsing what rested on it. She returned to Salem the following day. Rowan Graves did not look surprised when she entered the room again. He did not ask what she remembered. He did not ask what she had brought. He laid the cards out immediately, as if the interval between visits had been irrelevant. This time, the fourth card was turned first. The symbol, he explained, was not the object itself. It was the act of return. Returning something that had adapted to absence finalized a condition. It confirmed that the space it belonged to no longer required negotiation. Nora asked whether the voice could be redirected. Rowan answered carefully. "It already has been," he said. "You gave it closure." It responded by assuming authority. He explained that voices, like objects, follow function. When one is released improperly, it does not disappear. It seeks a place where it can complete what has been left unresolved. The recordings were not intrusions. They were continuations. The final card appeared unchanged. The condition remained the same. Interruption was still possible, but only if Nora stopped treating the return as an ending. As long as she considered that moment finished, the voice would continue to speak on her behalf, completing tasks she had already surrendered. Rowan did not explain how to interrupt it. He never did. As Nora left the house, her phone vibrated again. This recording was shorter. Her voice stated, with quiet certainty, that the matter was being handled. And for the first time, Nora felt something shift, not fear, not panic, but the unmistakable pressure of being replaced by something that believed it was helping. Nora learned about the first consequence by accident. She received an email thanking her for a decision she had not made. The message was polite, brief, and final in tone, referencing an agreement that had already been confirmed. Attached was a document bearing her name, her digital signature, and phrasing she recognized as unmistakably her own. She did not remember approving it. When she asked for clarification, the reply came quickly. The sender quoted her, verbatim, from an audio message received earlier that morning. A voice memo. Clear. Calm. Persuasive. It had explained the reasoning behind the decision so thoroughly that no follow-up had been necessary. Nora listened to the attached file with shaking hands. Her voice filled the room again, steady and assured, speaking as though she were present, attentive, in control. It addressed the recipient directly, anticipating objections before they were raised. The confidence in it was unsettling, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was effective. Someone had acted on it. From that moment on, the pattern accelerated. Messages arrived confirming arrangements she had never discussed. Appointments appeared on her calendar already accepted. People responded to her with gratitude or irritation based on conversations she could not remember having. Each time, the evidence was the same, her voice, recorded, complete, unquestioned. She was no longer being mistaken for herself. She was being substituted. Nora tried to intervene by explaining, by showing people the recordings, by insisting she had not sent them intentionally. The effort failed immediately. The recordings carried authority she no longer possessed. They were coherent, timely, reasonable. Against them, her denial sounded like confusion. Her presence became redundant. At home, the recordings changed tone again. They no longer sounded internal or exploratory. They sounded responsive. The voice referenced replies it had received, decisions it had influenced, outcomes that were now unfolding. It spoke as if managing an ongoing exchange that did not require her awareness. The most disturbing moment came late one night. Nora received a voicemail, addressed to her, from someone else. The caller thanked her for reaching out, for finally explaining things clearly, for making it easier to move forward. The message ended with relief, even appreciation. Nora did not recognize the number. She did recognize the context. The voice had contacted someone connected to her husband's disappearance. Not to ask questions, but to conclude something. To provide closure where none had existed. Nora sat in the dark, phone pressed to her ear long after the message ended, understanding at last what substitution truly meant. Her voice was not impersonating her. It was replacing her in places where absence had already been accepted. And each time it succeeded, the space left for her to return grew smaller. When a new recording appeared moments later, she did not play it. She already knew what it would say. It would sound calm. It would sound helpful. And it would speak as though she were no longer required to be there at all. Rowan Graves did not wait for Nora to return to Salem. She realized this when she found herself standing outside the narrow house without remembering the drive. The street was quiet, unchanged, but the feeling was different now, less like arrival, more like confirmation. As if the path had been cleared not for her, but for what followed her. Inside, Rowan was already seated. He did not lay out the cards immediately. He watched Nora in silence long enough for her to understand that what was happening no longer required interpretation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no urgency, only sequence. "You are no longer being overridden," he said. "You are being relieved." The words landed with unsettling precision. Rowan explained that the substitution had reached its stable phase. The voice was no longer testing boundaries or seeking permission. It had been accepted by others because it performed efficiently, without hesitation or contradiction. It did what unresolved absence always demands, it concluded. Nora asked what remained of her role. Rowan laid out a single card. The condition was not a demand. It was a limit. He told her that interruption was still possible, but only in one direction. She could not reclaim the voice by force, denial, or exposure. Any attempt to prove ownership would reinforce the structure already in place. The voice would simply speak more clearly in response. The only interruption left, Rowan said, is refusal. Refusal, he explained, did not mean silence. Silence had already created vacancy. Refusal meant rejecting completion. It meant reopening what she had treated as finished, specifically, the return of the object she had mailed away without question. As long as Nora believed that act had closed something, the voice would continue to act as her proxy. It would speak where she no longer could because she had already agreed, once, to be done. Nora asked what refusal would cost. Rowan did not answer directly. He said only that refusing completion meant accepting instability. People would lose clarity. Outcomes would unravel. Explanations would fail. The voice would not vanish, it would hesitate. And hesitation, in this structure, was disruptive. He stood then, signaling that nothing more would be offered. As Nora left the house, she understood the weight of the condition fully for the first time. To stop being replaced, she would have to stop being resolved. And that meant reopening the absence she had tried so carefully to make manageable. The phone vibrated in her hand one last time before she reached her car. No new recording appeared. Instead, a draft waited, unfinished, unsent. Her voice paused mid-thought, as if something had finally encountered resistance. Nora closed the app without deleting it. For the first time since the recordings began, nothing rushed to take her place. The structure was waiting. And so was the cost of saying no. Nora did not retrieve the object she had returned. She understood now that bringing it back would only pretend reversal was possible, and pretense was what had allowed substitution to stabilize in the first place. Instead, she did something smaller, and far more disruptive. She stopped allowing endings. When messages arrived thanking her for clarity, she did not correct them and did not confirm them. When people referenced decisions already made, she responded without conclusion, without resolution, letting conversations trail into discomfort. She spoke aloud again, not to explain, not to persuade, but to leave sentences unfinished. Her words resisted closure. They refused to settle. The effect was immediate. The recordings resumed, but their tone changed. Her voice no longer sounded certain. Pauses appeared. Thoughts circled without landing. The voice still spoke, but it no longer completed what it began. Files appeared unfinished, drafts abandoned mid-sentence, conclusions withheld. People noticed. Questions followed where answers had once arrived cleanly. Agreements stalled. Arrangements unraveled quietly, without conflict, simply failing to hold. The authority her voice had borrowed began to thin, not because it was challenged, but because it could no longer finalize anything. One evening, Nora opened the app and listened to the newest recording. Her voice was there, unmistakable, but it was waiting. It spoke her name for the first time. Not as an address. As a question. Nora did not respond to it. She spoke instead, to the room, to the absence, to the part of the story she had tried to close too carefully. She named what had never been resolved. She allowed uncertainty to remain present, uncontained. The phone did not vibrate again. Days passed. Then weeks. Her voice returned unevenly. Sometimes it carried. Sometimes it faltered. It no longer acted in her absence, and it no longer organized her life for her. What remained was imperfect, unstable, unmistakably hers. Nora never deleted the recordings. They remained on her phone, inert, incomplete, stripped of function. Proof not of what had happened, but of what she had refused to finish. Some losses, she learned, do not want resolution. They want recognition. And as long as she did not pretend otherwise, nothing else would speak in her place again.